Okay. Larry Anderson here. Life and Reason, the blog, Life and Reason, the section that we're doing today. This is Common Sense Part 2. I'm having a hard time breathing now. I'm in a lot of pain doing this. This is kind of an experiment. Hopefully that we can get these edited so that it's clear enough. And the it's a little bit awkward for me because I'm hurting, but that's why I'm doing this, is to get it done. So on we go. And I do have pleasure in this, and I'm so looking forward to hearing back the feedback from people and seeing how many of our critics can say something without calling me a nasty name or making up something about me or pointing out something obvious about me. They like to do that too. Well, did you see his fingernails? Who grooms their fingernails like that? Okay, so Common Sense Part 2. This is just a continuation of the last one. Again, there will be some notes, a little bit more technical, posted on the website. For this, you can go a little bit deeper. Let's just review very quickly the 4 axioms of common sense. Oh boy, I made notes in handwriting, which is never good. Axioms of common sense, I know them, but an external world exists. We are conscious beings aware of that external world. We are aware that we are aware, so we're not only conscious beings, but we are self-aware beings. We are aware of a special set of objects, other human beings who are also conscious and self-aware. So we all share that, and that's something that is vital to understand. And we all exist in the same world. So that's the 5th one. We're all in this boat together. There are 3 things to note about the relationship of these axioms and common sense. Actually, there are 4 things, and I will do the 4th one in a little while. The 4th. I got this. Okay. First, this is really interesting stuff. So again, think it through with me and take some time to either hear these again, read the information, or think about this. We're exploring some new territory here. And just let me note that the foundation for common sense, intuition, and the connection between reason and goodness, that far, the first 4 sort of steps in this process were influenced by the German philosopher Edmund Husserl, who lived in the early 20th century, and by my mentor and friend Stanley Rosen, who just died last May, about a year ago. Rosen actually develop the general context of common sense, intuition, reason, and the good and their interaction. These thoughts, however, are mine, and I've taken them in a deeper. I've tried to go deeper into what Rosen did and expanded as well. For example, the axioms of common sense and their interrelation in dialogue or dialectic dialogue that I showed last time, the 5 axioms, and when we ask someone, how are you, how those are tied into these axioms of common sense, into the world, and into a world of caring. That's mine, but nevertheless, Stanley Rosen in particular was a profound influence. And by the way, in the modern era, Husserl and Rosen are probably the only 2 people who have noticed this glaring vacuum in philosophical thought, the absence of common sense. We're just talking about, and we cut there, Edmund Husserl and Stanley Rosen as being the 2 people that have, 2 philosophers that in a modern era that have actually taken common sense seriously. Unfortunately, Edmund Husserl acknowledged the importance of common sense. I've actually written about this too, so we'll post this little thought here and on the blog. Edmund Edmund Husserl at least acknowledged the importance of common sense, though later on he insisted that only his phenomenological science could explain the pre-givenness of common sense. So Husserl went and did what most philosophers do. He went back and said, well, I've got it here, but now I got to give you a technical explanation of this. I'm going to give you the science of common sense, which I've already argued, and we'll see as we go deeper that there is no technical explanation. Stanley Rosen was very clear about that, and one of the reasons he was able to go past Husserl in developing his insights into common sense, intuition, reason, and goodness was because he knew and showed that there was no technical explanation for common sense, for a lived life, for a lived life. Which is yeah. As a matter of fact, Rosen wrote a book called The Elusiveness of the Ordinary, and I think it's Yale University Press. It's 2002 maybe published. I'm not sure, but the last 3 chapters in that book, although technical, are a huge step forward in philosophical thinking, and Rosen was not very well recognized in the United States, but in Europe he was a very huge counterweight to the nonsense that was going on. And the Europeans were open enough and smart enough to recognize that. They're not the sort of technophobes, everything's got to have a technical explanation that American thinkers tend to be. So, but Husserl, by the way, called what I call the axioms of common sense, he called it the pre-givenness of common sense. And that's a very good term for short term for the axioms, for the ground of common sense, is that it's pre-given. The axioms are pre-given. The external world is pre-given. So that's just a note there. But what about other modern philosophers? Martin Heidegger, who I talked about in the last in part 1 of Common Sense, Heidegger sought to overcome what he called average everydayness, or common sense, in being and time. I mean, he actually set about to kill it. And he changed his mind later on, and then he made no sense at all. Wittgenstein's Tractatus, Ludwig Wittgenstein, sorry, pain, hard to keep my lips going, when he was younger, wrote a book called the Tractatus. That's a long title, but it's called the Tractatus, and it was an effort to replace common sense with a logical flowchart of the world, and you can actually look it up. As a matter of fact, part of my inspiration for writing the 5 axioms of common sense and going from one to the next is that's exactly how Wittgenstein tries to kill common sense in the Tractatus. So it's kind of my joke to myself. Sartre, the existentialist French philosopher, all these people are in the 20th century, held that people grounded in common sense lived in authentic existence. He had it exactly wrong. That if you, he asserted that authentic existence required an act of the will and the abandonment of common sense. Yeah. People are just nuts. Oh, and it gets worse. Jacques Derrida, the French postmodernist philosopher de jour, I guess, died in, I don't know, late 60s, early 70s. He was the father of deconstructionism, which is, wow, which is just utter nonsense. And we're not going to go into these philosophical things. I'm just trying to show you that the major philosophers of the 20th century said no to common sense, except for Edmund Husserl, Stanley Rosen. Jacques Derrida went further, attempting to deconstruct common sense, which was very strange. And it's too technical, I'm not going into it. But like the world that we live in, common sense cannot be willed away, confined to a system, captured by a theory, or deconstructed by blather. common sense is the ground of everyday life. Okay, so 3 things to note about the relationship of axioms and common sense. First, the content available for commonsensical judgment expands over time. As cultures develop, as technologies advance, etc. Now, that's something we just don't think enough about. The world of objects that we live in changes. The objects in this world are contingent, but the axioms of common sense are not contingent. They're necessary. So, let me give an example. It was common sense to jump out of the way of a horse-drawn chariot because you would get crushed if you didn't jump out of the way. Now, it was not part of common sense in the Roman Empire to jump out of the way of a steam-powered motor car. In the early motor cars were steam-powered and went really fast, extremely dangerous, some of them quite heavy. And so, because there was no, because there was a contingent expansion of a contingent object in the world, there would be some sort of wild curiosity and maybe thinking it was God or something. If they had jumped out of the way, if somehow we could time trap, put a steam engine time and send it back to the Roman Empire, if they jumped out of the way, it would have been an instinct. It would not have been grounded in a shared, that's what common means, a shared common sense, because there was no shared common sense of a steam engine in the Roman Empire. So it was instinct that would drive moving, and they would have, they may have been too curious to get out of the way, thinking, it's a mirage or hallucination. Just like modern philosophy teaches that the world is. Maybe it would have stared at it and got squished. Who knows? But that's an important fact. So common sense, human beings have not adapted common sense to the expansion of technology and the changing world that we live in. We are getting distracted by by theories that have really no practical place in a world in which we live. As far as living a life, they don't help us, some of these things. I'll tell you about how that works in just a second. Since the axioms that ground common sense do not change, this is the second one. Since the axioms of the ground common sense do not change, what we mean by common sense and how we recognize and utilize commonsensical judgment is always the same. So, third, these two are related. The meaning of common sense cannot change, though the contents that concern common sense can. And so one of the really important points, if you just building up, if we're like archaeologists now, we're dusting off the dirt and with a little brush and the cobwebs to get down at the truth, at the ground, and what's really there, we have to understand that common sense is so enmeshed in living every day and in a human existence that we can't get away from common sense just because someone tells us, that quantum physics is ambiguous about the status of certain particles, and so we spend our time wondering if there might be a parallel universe or something like that, rather than that's not how you successfully live a human life, is by focusing and fearing those kind or focusing on those kind of things. And we'll get back to that in a minute. I'll give you a very good example of that. Live truth, the truth that matters most. Live truth cannot come from a philosopher's armchair, a politician's speeches, or priestly sermons. Truth is not yours or mine. It is not its, hers, or ours. It can never be theirs. Truth is exclusively ours, because truth is accessible to each one of us. Thus the pronouns we, I've been emphasizing this from the beginning, if you've been watching this, that we're trying to establish a dialogue, that what's important is we, as we develop life and reason. And even in the sections on depression and chronic pain, there's a lot. You'll notice how much I emphasize we, that this is a human process that we're in together, and we've forgotten that shared common humanity. Not forgotten, we just we don't pay attention to it anymore. You can't forget it because you live your whole life in common sense. It just drives you, and I'll show you an example of that, as I said, here in a second. And here's the fourth thing. Scientists and the fourth thing is, and I mentioned before, there is no theory of common sense. It doesn't change, but there's no theory. You can't write it down. You can't write it down and say, well, this is what common sense is in all situations. It's rather like, and I don't want to push this too far, but think about the concept of justice. Common sense is kind of like justice. We know that there's justice, and we want justice, and we recognize justice when it happens, but there is no technical explanation of what is a just act, because there's so much ambiguity built into human interaction that there is no technical pathway to justice. That is part of a living process, and we begin. Justice, however, is more of an ends rather than a means, which common sense is more of a means, so it doesn't quite work. But we develop a sense of justice as we grow and see acts of injustice and justice in the world. And so we should develop our sense of common sense as we grow and mature, because that's how we negotiate through this world. And it gives us a sense of caring and the importance of others and a real understanding of ourselves when we do that, when we participate that. So scientists and philosophers have always sought more technical, more systematic, more accurate versions of reality. Since there could be no technical or systematic account of human life as it is lived, each new technical attempt to describe reality conflicts at one point or another with common sense. A technical description of the world is rarely a prescription for how to live in the world. A technical description is not a prescription for living in the world, in the world of human beings. Now let me give you an example of how silly and how bad this can go wrong. Ernest Rutherford, who was like the grandfather maybe of nuclear physics, was a physicist, 19th century early, who was the guy who, 19th century, not early 19th century, who was a physicist, who was the person who discovered that there was a lot of space in atoms, that there wasn't, that matter, there was lots of emptiness in matter. And he described that, and and that had a huge influence on things like quantum physics and how physics developed out of his discovery. Now, there's a story, and I think this is actually, I think this is verified. I've seen this in strange places, like on Nova. I saw this story told, and I've read it 3 or 4 places. I assume this actually happened. I've read about this event. The day after, the morning after Rutherford made his discovery about the emptiness of atoms, the empty space, he was afraid to get out of bed because he was afraid that the floor might not be all there, because he knew there was lots of empty space inside of atoms, and so there was lots of empty space inside of floor planes. But that fear, prompted by a technical construction of the world, notice how it conflicted with common sense, and notice how it was actually dangerous for Rutherford and inconsistent. If Rutherford had actually believed that, he should have panicked laying in bed, because the bed has the same amount of space between its atoms as the floor planks, and so does the ground beneath him, and so right through the center of the world, and into nothingness, poor Ernest was headed. And notice, by the way, that if he had insisted on living his life as if there were no space, as if it was dangerous to walk on, or dangerous to interact with physical objects because there was emptiness, he would have been nuts. He would have been technically insane to keep believing that theory about by applying that technical theory in everyday life. It's dangerous to actually do that. So we cannot. We have to get back to common sense, even if some of these technical theories give us some inkling that there's some sort of strange mystery in the physics of very small objects. Well, that's interesting, and it's true, but it's not a prescription for living. It can be helpful. Maybe it'll help invent some new drugs for curing cancer or something like that. But in day-to-day life, when we get up in the morning, we do not fear falling through the floor. We feel around for our slippers. That's what you do when you get up in the morning. And that's the basis of common sense that underlies human existence. Okay, now I want to... we will get in, as we develop this, the connection of life and reason. As we develop this process that we're in, we will get into some specific examples. Some of them will be controversial, about politics, about religion, the meaty stuff. But I will not be taking an ideological position or a sectarian position. I just want to show how common sense teaches us something about, or helps us understand how politics and religion should be how they should be integrated into a rational life. Now, but here's the negative, first negative type of point. It's not terribly specific, but it's important to understand this, to try to show how important what we're talking about will become in real terms, political, religious, interfamilial relationships, everything. How important what we're discussing is the distance between the truth and us. That we are talking about, the distance between the truth and us, is manifest in the inability to articulate and share our thoughts about the world we live in. This distance has always been a barometer of political oppression, clerical ascendancy, and intellectual conformity. In decadent times like the current postmodern phase, our distance from truth betrays mental laziness, cultural ennui, and social divisiveness. Politically correct impotence is muttered in the self-satisfied and cowardly surrender of one's humanity when someone says, "Your truths are yours and my truths are mine," and they mean it. It's cowardly, and it is a rejection of... It's an insult to other human beings. It's an insult to the external world. It is just a way to opt out of responsibility. But I'm not talking about responsibility. I'm talking about the goodness, the happiness that a life of reason and understanding, the common sense, understanding and being able to use common sense to apply common sense in our life, getting back to living life. It's a positive thing, and it's a ground. It's a way to understand your moral principles. It's a way to question your political ideologies, to get straight in your head which political tasks are important for human beings, and which of them are wishful or group thinking, or clannish ideas. Okay, so there are two things here that come out that I want to stress at the end of this. There is no technical description of how to live in the world. And there is no relativistic solution for how to live in the world. Ernest Rutherford, fearing to step on the floorboards, or the person who dodges human reality by saying, my truth is mine and your truth is yours. And I've heard that. I mean, I hear it way too often from people who should know better. And it really, when someone says that, I immediately lose respect for them. Because there is no technical description, technical prescription for living in this world, and there is no relativistic assertion of relativism that works for living in this world. A tractor trailer barreling down the road is not a topic for philosophical speculation. It's not an enticement to scientific experimentation. And it's not a moment of let's back up. A tractor trailer barreling down the road is not a topic for philosophical speculation or scientific experimentation or an assertion of one's relativistic principle of truth if that tractor trailer is barreling down on us. Common sense puts us on notice that in the lived world, which is the real world, the oncoming rig is death.